Hello. So I've started this series, the engineering series, by talking about first the difference between chemistry and chemical engineering. And there's good reason for that. The reason is because these are two of the departments where people have a lot of confusions and misconceptions. So let's talk about what the difference is. The main difference, of course, is that chemical engineering is an engineering department and chemistry is a science department. If you haven't watched my video talking about the difference between science and engineering, you can find that linked down below. Now, these two departments are widely popular. And all the times when one applies to one, say chemical engineering, they would tend to put chemistry as a second choice. But perhaps that's not the best idea because of how different they are. So let's start by talking about chemistry. Fortunately, most people have a good idea about what chemistry is. And chemistry is the study of chemical reactions, looking at formulas, compounds, like understanding what specific compounds are, how to use them perhaps, and how we can create new ones. And that is mostly what chemistry is about, on the large part. There are, of course, other things involved. So now let's talk about the overlap. Now, I did previously say that chemistry involves certain reactions. Well, that's where they overlap. You see, both departments talk a lot about processes. However, commonly, it's usually the chemist that would figure out a new novel process for like a new compound, whereas the engineer would be more focused on optimizing that process, like to how to, for example, change a small scale process to a large scale process. Like, for example, say detergents. A chemist would be able to figure out how to make them in the lab, but a chemical engineer would learn how to actually make it producible, like by mass production, how to create containers of it. But yes, that's the overlap, and either party might actually take this specific job. Now, for the chemical engineering part. Chemical engineers, just like any other engineering department, are most interested in optimization. That is, taking processes that already exist and optimize them on the large scale and make sure that they are going according to plan. Like, for example, in a plant, understand that the heating and the energy is happening correctly, the piping, the pressures that are involved inside these pipes. These are usually the concerns of chemical engineers. And of course, this goes without saying that hence quality control would usually be the job of, say, a chemical engineer. Not the only job, but one of them. Let's give an example to illustrate the difference. Let's say we want to separate hydrogen and oxygen. The chemist would be involved in understanding what the reaction is, how it's feasible, like what sort of energy is necessary, how much heating is, for example, say necessary, what sort of conditions are needed. And they would also create like some sort of a process, what sort of processes can actually lead to this kind of reaction. The engineer would then come and optimize this process on a large scale. Let's understand how, rather than taking a small beaker of water and turning it to two small beakers of hydrogen or oxygen and so forth, the engineer would understand how to actually instead put this in a large container, in a power plant, for example, and actually produce containers like tons of hydrogen and oxygen. And of course, mistakes can happen, accidents can happen. The engineers would then be involved in making sure how to avoid these mistakes or precautions that will help us avoid any sort of disaster on the large scale and make sure that it is maximally profitable. So yes, I just described what each of these departments are and the difference in how they work. But an important difference is how they study. And of course, when choosing your major, that is one of the most important factors. So chemists in college, bachelor's degrees, would study things such as organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, biochemistry, maybe toxicology, and they would get in very, very deep detail, really understanding the reasons and the workings behind these processes. Whereas an engineer, yes, of course, most engineering departments actually do study quite a bit of chemistry, and a chemical engineer would study quite more of it, but just not as much detail as a chemist. And instead, a chemical engineer would have to study more about mathematical processes to actually create mathematical models more and understand the physics of how it works, because in real life, all the other disciplines of science are involved. And a chemical engineer needs to learn how to integrate all of them to actually apply them in real life. So there would be a lot of programming perhaps, and that's something that you should consider. Like, say you are thinking of going to chemical engineering, therefore you are prepared to study things like a lot of physics, a lot of mathematics, some chemistry too, of course, and other courses as well. So if you do not get the chance to go to a chemical engineering school, maybe you want to go to another engineering school instead, because once again, you will have similar courses. Whereas if you decide to go to chemistry altogether, then the course will be entirely different. And you have to figure out which one is best suited for you. So yeah, that's pretty much the difference. So if you found this helpful, please don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time.